Well, folks, it's finally happened. Crowdfunding has been vindicated. Kickstarter has made a masterpiece. Pillars of Eternity is a follow-up to the handful of Infinity Engine RPGs from the late 90s, picking up where Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, and Icewind Dale left off. It was made by the folks who made those games and grew frustrated with the publisher's insistence that they didn't sell well back then or now, but the final product plays as if none of that ever happened. There's little fan service or callbacks. It stands on its own as a successor to those games, not a nostalgic tribute. It's 2015, and a game that looks and plays like it's from 1999 is one of the biggest, most exciting, and visually polished games of the year. It just might be the best game I've played since starting this channel. Without a doubt, it is the most enjoyable one I've been able to review. To be fair, I have my preferences. I was already a fan of Obsidian RPGs before, and I'm sure that at least a small part of my enjoyment came from the relief of seeing a crowdfunded project deliver so well. Because this is the dream. This is that wave of 2012 Kickstarter optimism made real. This is a massive, beautiful, well-produced and polished game that could not have happened any other way. Where do I even start? I don't really know, and I don't think the devs did either. There's so much to cover. This is a gameplay system that's designed to track adventuring over a period of months and distances of miles. It doesn't scale well to a tight-knit tutorial dungeon for the intro, nor does it handle exposition gracefully. Although I love how Pillars turned out, no game is perfect.
Fine one. Nothing you won't see on half the hills of Air Glonfoth. Money to be made selling their knickknacks in Defiance Bay if you don't mind getting stuck with Glonfoth and arrows now and again. They didn't build them, but I'll be the effigy if they don't watch them like a mother bear.
That's one of the first lines you hear in the whole game, and this guy might as well not be speaking English. The writing in Pillars is thick. It is thick with constant references to an exhaustive internal lore. In order to understand what's going on, you have to learn about wars, religions, gods, false gods, politics, norms, and laws, and multiple cultural interpretations of all those things to grasp even a hunch of what these people are talking about. It is thick with flowery prose and descriptive language that asks you to paint mental pictures just as vivid as the graphics. It is thick with characters who speak within canonical context. Some characters have personalities so thickly immersed in this fiction that you have to read their lines twice just to understand what they said. And even on top of all that linguistic immersion, the concepts discussed get very abstract. Companions will wake you up in the middle of the night asking burning philosophical questions about the realness of memories or something. Even during the downtime, even when talking to people, this game expects you to stay awake and fully alert. In order to really participate in the plot, you have to read between the lines and vicariously think as your character. There are some brilliant narrative tricks in there that you might not notice otherwise, but the downside of the game getting so wordy about itself is that it's easy to lose concentration and zone out, missing whatever elaborate description triggered some grand reveal. It is also thick with pulpy high fantasy cliché that can get hard to bear. This is a universe where no one stays dead and no one's mind is private, so expect a lot of convenient supernatural plot twists. But the main quest does eventually lead to payoffs that crack open the orthodoxy of what is otherwise a very conventional Dungeons & Dragons spin-off. But bear with that, this is a game that demands an intellectual investment from the player, with a narrative design that is as challenging and rewarding to decipher as is any game to play. And, as a great thinking person's RPG, it turns combat into tactical puzzles that require diligent and creative strategy to win. This may be as slow-paced an RPG as any other, but if you're not paying attention to what you're doing in a fight, you are dead in seconds. I had to do a lot of quick saving when starting out. It's been forever since I played a game with this kind of combat, where the labyrinthian complexities of pen and paper rules are fast-forwarded into real time. If you try to follow that combat log in the bottom corner of the screen, you may get an idea of just how chaotic the underlying processes are. Frequent pausing is imperative. You don't want to be pausing every few orders, you want to be pausing every few frames. The combat is balanced and paced in a way that makes almost every encounter potentially lethal, so plans and tactics always win over improvisation. You'll want to ambush enemies into lines of matchlock gunfire. You want to circle ranged attackers around slow-moving melee, and before you know it, you'll be slaying enormous bosses, not with the ease of leveling into them, but rather with the satisfaction of applying effective tactics learned after hundreds of failures. The downside of such demanding combat is that the micromanagement of it all gets fatiguing in the long term. and mobs are placed thick enough to make a lot of that combat unavoidable. To save time, you'll want to make the most efficient formations possible, and hotkey every spell you can, because they'll all be useful at some point. Which is actually unfortunate, because the cyclopedian amounts of text here skimp on explaining the interface. A few hours in, I was wondering why my number buttons were no longer working, only to find the first clue on how to fix it by pressing numbers that were bound to nothing at all. Also, here's a tip. You can mouse over spells and abilities and press a hotkey to bind them. This isn't explained anywhere in the game. I had to Google it. I didn't learn how to make use of the formation screen until catching a loading screen tip, and the only thing that's needed to fix all of those problems would just be an interface section for your codex. The game's priorities are lore, visual polish, and combat, which lead to a few unconventional rules that cut down on time spent elsewhere. For example, you have unlimited inventory space. There's no need for a mule, not a lot of inventory management time, and no hard decisions to make about looting hundreds of junk items. You can turn your bottomless stash off in the options menu, but it's enabled by default, and it seems like the way the game was intended to be played, because miraculously, the economy manages to deflate your trade-in value enough to keep prices of decent equipment competitive. It will take hundreds of unoccupied enemy armors to buy one decent piece for yourself. In the early game, at least. That changes later on. Throughout most of your adventure, there are 2 persistent side quests that keep prodding you. A bottomless mega dungeon ripe for the picking, and a base management side venture. But like any base management minigame in a game not about base management, it throws the economy out of balance once earnings start to roll in. Another strange rule here is that enemies don't reward XP. Well, kind of. You don't get XP per kill, instead you get experience for filling out monster codex entries which reward XP in intervals of kills. And you also get it from discovering new locations, which basically means uncovering more of the maps those mobs are guarding, so you're probably going to be slashing through them anyways. Also, only a couple of these level-upable skills are actually useful for combat. The level-up brush in this game is cast in broader strokes, which you'd think would make it easier to balance the combat for the entire length of the game, but I still managed to be overpowered for the last third of it, stomping through enemies easily, methodically, every single time up to the final boss, which finally climbed the difficulty curve back up to where it should be. Unfortunately, the later game scaling doesn't seem to expect you to do an awful lot of side quests beforehand, and I can't wait to see some small, subtle balancing mods come out and fix that. But besides those quirks, what we've got here is a game that's somewhere between Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 in terms of size, scope, and reactivity, with design decisions that aren't necessarily modern twists, but rather timeless improvements. The interface would seem like it follows Baldur's Gate to a fault, until you notice some clever little improvements.
You must gather your party before venturing forth.
Those words should strike fear into the hearts of any Infinity Engine veteran. But in this game, they don't repeat, and as soon as you click the edge of a map, your party gathers to venture forth automatically. If you loot a container while the party's selected, the closest member will venture off for it, while everyone else continues with their previous order. And after Wasteland 2, I was very happy that locks are picked in the most efficient method within just one click. Plus, there's a fast-forward button to cut down on time spent running from A to B. But personally, I didn't think the fast mode here was quite fast enough, but that's just nitpicking. All of those problems are what nitpicking Pillars of Eternity sounds like, because the 70 hours I spent with this past week with it, they were just amazing. It's a beautiful game. These pre-rendered HD backgrounds look absolutely stunning. It has been 15 years since I've seen pre-renders look this sharp and clear. They're even bump mapped to keep the lighting immersive, and our 3D characters are at a high enough fidelity to blend right in. It's 2D that looks better than any kind of 3D that could have been done on their Kickstarter budget, which is one of many reasons I was in love with this game for the past week. It retains the dying art of creative ingenuity. You'll get hit by that Kickstarter budget as soon as you press the New Game button. Where there would be an FMV or an opening cutscene is instead a text box.
5 wagons.
Where there would be extra animation work, like if your character needs to shimmy up a wall or jump a gap, you'll get text instead. Which isn't a compromise, because those text boxes are actually choose-your-own-adventure dialogue trees that pull resources from your inventory and your stats to have your characters do some very unexpected stunts. I came to relish these scenes. The artwork, the writing, the choices, and the outcomes have an undeniable charm to them, and give the game some very versatile storytelling. Believe it or not, stimulating the player's imagination with descriptive writing and interesting choices is far more engaging than any cutscene or QTE would be. The quieter moments in Pillars of Eternity, like those little storybook scenes or when you're left alone to study the details of these vivid backgrounds, can be sublime. And the louder moments, like the combat, are strategic treats. The critical movements of its story and lore, the wonderful swampy verbosity of it all, is a euphoric head trip. It has been almost 2 decades since a time when games encouraged players to read into context, to do the math behind the combat, and to follow written directions rather than quest markers. And that's why Pillars of Eternity feels like such a triumph for me. It somehow does all of that without the broken quests, the unfriendly interface, or the shoddy designs that usually come with old-school ruggedness. I did encounter glitches, but only one that affected gameplay, and it was easily worked around. By Obsidian standards, it's quite a polished game. It manages to be a smooth, slick ride through convoluted RPG reactivity and murky prose. It works because it respects the player's intelligence, it stimulates their imagination, and it asks them to put in what it can give back. Games like that don't come out often, and when they do, they are usually cherished. The Pillars of Eternity stand as a stellar reminder of a forgotten genre and an inspiring beacon for what could come in the future.